Okay, fantastic. Baruch atah Adonai aleinu melech haolam shehakol nihiyeh b'dvarei.
Amen.
Okay, welcome to everybody. Thank you so much for joining. What a privilege to be able to start a brand new series with all the chevra who are here in person and all the yidden who are joining us on Zoom and everybody who's going to be watching this recording later. Anytime we begin something new, it's with Chassidus. There's a new energy, a new spirit. And this spirit of Chassidus is exactly what we need in the month of Elul. It's a new opportunity. It's a new thing. Mamish to start at the beginning. And hopefully it'll be a journey that we'll gain immeasurably from. Tzidkas Tzaddik is a foundational sefer in my life. It's been from the beginning really of my journey into Chassidus already. I can't remember my first encounter with the sefer, but I know that it had an amazing impact on me and continues to have. It's been my Shabbos sefer, walking back and forth for quite a while. And it's a real privilege and a pleasure to be able to make an attempt at entering into the deep waters of this very small, very thin sefer together, b'siyata d'shmaya, with again the chevra who are here with us in person and those who are joining us on the Zoom. I think it's impossible really to speak about any sefer in the world, any teaching, without speaking about the teacher. I think any time that you speak about a sefer and it's divorced, it's disconnected from the one who taught the Torah, already it's not a good sign. It's a sort of already in the realm of information, and it's disconnected from the personality. It's disconnected from the spirit that it was flowing forth from, which is such an important part of liman HaTorah. We don't speak about the Torah as having been given to us. It's a Torah that's taught to us. Hamalamei Torah la'amei Yisrael. Hashem teaches us Torah. It's not just Torah. It's Hashem's Torah, or it's Torah's Moshe. It's a Torah that was transmitted by Moshe Rabbeinu. It becomes something else when it's connected to a personality. So I think it's really impossible, especially with a tzaddik like this, to talk about the sefer, and to get into learning the sefer without first having a little bit of a portrait of who this tzaddik was. Reb Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin, Zeuchuso, aleinu. It's a singular, extraordinarily unique tzaddik. All the tzaddikim were unique. Each one had their own inyan. But Reb Tzadok was like from a whole different story. And I want to go through just a little bit. They have over here Pirkei Toldos in the beginning of this particular edition of Tzidkas HaTzaddik that has a very beautiful biur. So if you'd like, it's 2 volumes. I highly recommend it. And in the beginning, they go through a little bit of Reb Tzadok's biography. They leave out some bits, which I know from other places and did some other preparation from other sources. But I want to share with you some of the information that comes out of this Pirkei Toldos before we begin to see the first pieces in the Sefer b'siyata d'shmaya. So Reb Tzadok HaKohen, just to put him in history, is born in 1823. And Reb Tzadok is nifter at the age of 77 in 1900. Okay, so that's where he is in history. This is about 3rd, 4th generation Chassidus. And Reb Tzadok is born in a very non-Chassidic milieu, a very non-Chassidic background, not just non-Chassidic, but very strongly anti-Chassidic. He grew up in a Misnagdic family, although it is true that Reb Tzadok's father, who was a great Tzaddik, his father was called Rabbi HaKohen, and he was the Av Beis Din of a city called Kreisberg, which was in Lithuania. It says here that his father was warm to Chassidim, maybe uncharacteristically, especially in those communities. He did express a certain chiba, a certain love, a certain connection with Chassidim, although generally the whole mishpacha was a very misnagdik mishpacha. Great to see you. Thanks for joining us. And his father a little bit had that warmth, but the rest of the family and the background and the culture was very staunchly misnagdik, was anti-Chassidus under the influence of the yageinu of Vilna. Reb Tzadok, from the very, very beginning, it was clear that he was an absolute genius. He was a yageinu olam from a very, very young age. they could already tell that his learning and his grasp of the material was something super extraordinary, like beyond. And he was, understandably, even though he had many siblings, but he was the apple of his father's eye, and his father cherished him and watched over him, and obviously had great hopes for this child that he understood he was raising not a regular, like a super unique child, a super unique neshama in his home. So much so, this is a very tragic story, that at the age of 6, Reb Tzadok was walking in the street, and of course his whole thoughts was wrapped up in learning at 6 years old already, because we're going to see he finished Shas at 7 years old. He finished the whole entire Shas at 7. So 6 years old, I guess he was on his way, he was coming to the later Masechtas, but of course his whole mind is wrapped up in learning Torah. And he didn't see that coming around the corner was a wagon that was carrying very, very heavy merchandise. And he didn't see, and he was hit by the wagon. And Baruch Hashem says here, like a nace, he emerged just with like a few scratches. But somebody who witnessed the accident thought for sure that the worst had happened and ran and told his father that his son was hit by a wagon. And this Av Beis Din, his father, the Av Beis Din of Kreisberg, he fainted because he was out of fright, and then he had a heart attack and he passed away. He was nifter from this. At the age of 6, Reb Tzadok is orphaned from his father out of fear of losing Reb Tzadok, and Reb Tzadok loses him. And so, whatever warmth his father displayed by Chassidus, it isn't clear that the uncle, who was called the Kapei Zav, also a big tzaddik, displayed the same warmth. And you see, we're going to see in a minute, that whatever warmth there was, or whatever connection there was to Chassidus sort of disappeared, and Reb Tzadok grew up in a family of Misnagdim. Like I said before, at the age of, it was 8 years old, Reb Tzadok finished all of Shas and knew it absolutely clear. The reason why I mentioned the age of 7 is because at the age of 7, Reb Tzadok already was performing what's called Hashpas Chalaim, because his uncle had traveled away, and it was his way to send messages back to the family to let them know where he was, what was going on with him, and they hadn't heard from him in a long time, and they thought the worst had happened to the uncle who had adopted Reb Tzadok, who was orphaned from his father. And Reb Tzadok at the age of 7 knew how to utter Kabbalistic shemas, and brought about in a dream, like Ruach HaKodesh, to be able to find out what happened to his uncle. And it turned out, not only was his uncle okay, but his uncle had actually taken the position of Rav in another city, and for whatever reason his letters were held up. It wasn't like communication today, and his letter was on the way, whatever it was, but that was at the age of 7. At the age of 8, Reb Tzadok finished the whole entire Shas, and Tzaddikim began to discuss halacha with him, to talk with this child in Pilpul. Among them, Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, Zeuchuso the Abbas of the city of Kovna, who said about him, Muftachani boy, he said, I'm just reading it from here, I promise, Shehu Yigdal a Gadol B'Yisrael. It's absolutely positive that this child will become a Gadol B'Yisrael.
He's slightly after, he didn't see the Gaon of Vilna.
No.
Because probably Tough Kuf Peggy.
Later, yeah.
1823?
Yeah, I think much later, right? The Vilna Gaon would have been after in...
whatever.
Was it in the beginning of the 1800s?
I don't know when he passed away.
I don't know, but they didn't...
passed away, Tough Kuf Ein Gimel. So he was born 10 years after.
Okay. No, I don't think that they saw each other. At this period of time, he began to answer Shalos Utshuvas in Halacha. He was at 8 years old, from all around the world. He became like a phenomenon, like world-renowned. And Rabbanim, Gedolim, people from all over the world were sending him Shalos, and he was answering them. And we still have printed some of his Shalos Utshuvas from then, until he became Bar Mitzvah. And the Bar Mitzvah, you might imagine, was attended from Rabbanim and Tzaddikim from all across Lithuania. They came to this Bar Mitzvah, and sometimes we think like, oh, must be they were all like that. Like they weren't. They maybe they were ahead in terms of their learning, than we are in our education today. But such a thing was literally chad b'dara, and nobody had ever seen such a thing. One in a generation, and he gave over a pshetel, very, very long speech. Arba pulpulim. There were 4 different areas of halacha that were covered in his drasha, and it's actually printed in the back of his Sefer Meshiv Tzedek, where he writes, Drush Darashti B'Shabbos Parsha Shkalim, etc. Shenasesi Bar Mitzvah B'Shva Neskeres. That was the week that he became Bar Mitzvah, and that was the speech that he gave. And he writes over there in the beginning of the presentation that he presented there for the Bar Mitzvah, he writes, although I'm so young, he says, I request from those who are here to listen carefully to my words. To a young person, it was his Bar Mitzvah, because he said, although I might not be well on in years to really have developed his learning, although again, he probably covered more ground, by the time he was Bar Mitzvah than most people cover in lifetimes. But he said, still, I want you to listen carefully, because you can't compare the divrei Torah of a person who's a little bit older, and it's more likely that they've fallen into Averis. He was made on himself until 13 years old. Hevel pesha ein b'chet. He said that's why those words of Torah had even a higher level of preciousness. That was the year that he became Bar Mitzvah. That year he became a Chassan as well. And he was married into a wealthy family that was able to support him. And this is what he did. He sat and he wrote Shalos Teshuvos, and Rabbanim came and Mafalpa with him, a young boy, 13, 14 years old. He was writing Kuntresim against this and that, like Mamish, holding his own against Rabbanim and Tzaddik Adar. One thing that they write over here, which is going to be important for the next bit, that they actually leave out from this little biography that they put in the beginning of the Sefer, because it's incredibly painful. Even so, I feel that it should, it's true, it's part of his life, it's a very important part of his life. But they left that part out, but we'll discuss that in a minute. But it says over here that during that time period, he became an unbelievable parush, a person who is separated from all aspects of this worldliness, and a machmir in halacha like nobody had ever seen. Some of his chumras are that he refused to eat any food that he himself was not mashkiach on mitchila v'ad soif. So he would only eat if he was supervising the wheat to make sure that it didn't tamam from the beginning. Any meat, he had to be the mashkiach on the shaychet to make sure that it was shechted properly. He wouldn't Pesach. He would have the seder by himself because he didn't trust anybody else who's eating there, and gebraks and different things going on. Like a phenomenal level of diktuk halacha, like to the nth degree. This is the way that he was, super stringent, super strict. It says he ate alone. And this is like sort of an introduction to the following thing. The following thing is, as a result of his very, very high levels of purity, something terrible happened, which is really difficult to talk about because you can't imagine Jews doing this to other Jews. But this is the fact of his life, and it's left out of this biography, but it's a very important part of understanding who this person was, is that one of the, or maybe a group of Toshavei Kreisberg, of the people who lived in that town where he was, became very jealous that the family that Reb Tzadok HaKohen married into was zocheh to have such a son-in-law. And they took it upon themselves to break off the shidduch. Imagine such a thing. That they wanted to break the shidduch because they couldn't forgive that someone else should have such a son-in-law. And they understood that Reb Tzadok was such a kaddish and such a holy, high level of diktuk and precision in terms of his halacha. He took it very, 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 very seriously. That they somehow arranged that it should be implanted in his mind the thought that maybe his wife was not being faithful to him. And they left love letters in his Sfarim that, like, she somehow ended up in his Sfarim, like letters to other people. And they spread rumors in town. And the final, straw that broke the camel's back is that they arranged one day that Reb Tzadok should be walking by the clothing store that belonged to his in-laws, that his wife was working at this clothing store. And they arranged somehow that some kind of government official should be walking in to the clothing store right when Reb Tzadok was passing by. And this particular person was known to be a very, very, like a brute, a really cruel person. And there was no, like, I can't shake your hand because, my religion. You see, it was life or death, mamish, with him. And Reb Tzadok was walking by, and from the back he sees Gentiles coming in to the clothing store, and he sees that his wife is taking his hand. And that was it. That was it. Like after all the rumors and after everything else Reb Tzadok had seen, and he already began to become suspicious, this was it. And he gave her a get. And she refused to accept it because she knew that she was totally innocent. And it wasn't fair. And she was deserving of such a husband. It wasn't stam. She was deserving. It was a chashuv family. But Reb Tzadok, once it already came into Reb Tzadok's mind that he was, that he was suspicious, he paskined for himself als kohen that already it was like she was already divorced, even though she wasn't divorced. And he, as a kohen, couldn't live with her because in his heart he had already made up his mind to divorce her, even though halachically she wasn't divorced yet. But that was it. But you can't divorce Baal Karchach. Right after Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom, one of the things that Rabbeinu Gershom instituted is that you can't divorce a woman against her will. So what can you do? Because he didn't want to stay married. So Rabbeinu Gershom worked into his cherem something that's known as a heter mei rabbanim. That if a person travels around and gets the signatures on his get that he's trying to give, but the woman doesn't want to receive it, if he gets 100 signatures from leading tzaddikim of the generation, then it can go through, and it's considered even if she doesn't accept it. It's again the way that it works is it makes a loophole in the cherem against marrying two women, right? And so he's allowed to marry another woman, but this is called heter mei rabbanim, and this is whether she wants to accept it or not, he's allowed to marry somebody else. This is a crucial part of the story, because otherwise it's very hard to understand what happened next. So over here they just put in a line, Me'es Hashem Yisbarach mesabiv kol hasibas neshavsa siba mesuyemes shebegina yatzar Rabbeinu hashari beisai. Over here they say something happened. They leave out that whole story, which I think is a very important story to understand what happens next. And somehow something caused Reb Tzadok to travel. But it wasn't just something. You have to understand what it was. This is what caused Reb Tzadok to travel. This is like classic, sort of like censorship. Like, it's emes. This is what happened. It's not pleasant, but this was part of his life. Reb Tzadok began to travel around all of Europe, way beyond Lithuania. First, he traveled throughout Lithuania, and he met all of the yageinu hadar, and he made deals with them that if he could vanquish them in halacha, if he could, overcome them in pilpul, then they would have to sign the heter mei rabbanim, even if they disagreed with him. And every single one of them, from Reb Shlomo Kluger, like we said before, to the Rabbi Yitzchak HaKohen Spector, who he met again, all of the different gedolim. It reads like a who's who, of all the tzaddikim and the gedolim and the poskei hadar of that generation. He went and he personally met with all of them. This is when he was 20 years old. And for 4 years he traveled until he needed more signatures from the Gedolim. He crossed over the border of Lithuania and he came into Poland. And this is where he began to encounter the Gedolei Chassidus, who even though he came from a very misnagdic oppositional background, they were still tzaddikim, and maybe there weren't enough signatories in Lithuania. And this is how Reb Tzadok comes to meet all of the Gedolei Chassidus. And he went around and he met with the Chiddushei HaRim, and he met with the Divrei Chaim of Sons, and he met with the Gedolei Tzaddikei Hadar. And he gets their signatures on his heter mei rabbanan, even though many of them disagreed. And many of them maybe saw Baruch HaKodesh, that what he was doing wasn't really right klapei Shmaya, that she was really innocent. But he vanquished them, and that was the deal. And he was able to outdo all of them. There was only one that he wasn't able to overcome in halacha, and that was the Chiddushei HaRim. The Chiddushei HaRim, he had to say to the Chiddushei HaRim, he says, you won. The Chiddushei HaRim knew more than him, or was able to be mefalpel deeper than him, and the Chiddushei HaRim looked at him in the eyes and said a very painful thing. He said, listen, I'm telling you, you're making a mistake. And if you go through with this, min hashamayim, they're not going to look lightly on the embarrassment of this young woman, and you will not be able to bring any children into the world. Even if you get married again, it's not going to happen. And kachava, Reb Tzadok was married 2 other times, and Reb Tzadok did not leave behind any children. And later in life, this is why it's important, Reb Tzadok regretted what he did. And Reb Tzadok has a whole beautiful mimer on this, that you cannot be megarish a woman in Baal Karcha. And he says that this is symbolic of our relationship with Hashem. that even that there's no such thing. The deep epinimi is the ratzon of a yid is to be connected no matter what, sort of signifying that he understood that he was mistaken. Although again, it's and they are right in this line. It's of course HaKadosh Baruch Hu was Mesabi, because without this, Reb Tzadok wouldn't have become Reb Tzadok. Reb Tzadok would be what Reb Tzadok was. But what Reb Tzadok became to the world was only possible because he traveled. It's an interesting story they say over here. Once he came to the Tzaddik, the Yeshua Yaakov, even though in a footnote they say it's not possible because the years don't match up. One of the Tzaddikim the Gabbai did not want to let him in. They'd never heard of this person, Tzaddik. Tzaddik comes. They didn't want to let him in. A young person, who do you think you are to come and just demand, a yachidus with the Tzaddik, with the Rebbe, with the Rav? And he sort of pushed a little bit, and maybe he snuck in or something like that into the room. And so the Yeshua Yaakov saw this. The son, Reb Mordechai Zev, saw that he snuck in or something like that, and he said to his father, "I want you to know he has chutzpah. He's acting chutzpahdik. He didn't wait for the line. Whatever it was, Reb Tzaddik is Reb Tzaddik. He wasn't like, he was obviously not a normal. You understand? He was super normal. So I don't know, whatever the circumstances were. I don't want to say he cut the line, but he was acting with azus, with chutzpah. So the Yeshua Yaakov looked at him and he was trying to give him musar. He said, "Avrech, ha'im ata baki kfar b'chol shas ba'al peh?" He says, "What are you acting with chutzpah for? Do you know the whole shas by heart?" So Reb Tzaddik answered him, "What if I only know half of shas by heart?" So the Yeshua Yaakov said, "Half of shas by heart?" He said, "Which half?" So Reb Tzaddik said, "Whichever half you want." Reb Tzaddik was a baki in both halves of shas. So then, once he saw that, he let him in, and they had a conversation, and they built a close relationship. Along his journey, Reb Tzaddik encountered in the Beis Medrash of it says over here, one of the Batei Medrash of Kutsk, from which Ishbitzer came, because the Ishbitzer, the Mea Shilach, was a Talmud, a student of the Kutzker before they broke. He saw a young Avrech, and the Avrech was Reb Leibel Eger. Reb Leibel Eger, the Baal Torah's Emes, was a grandson of Rabbi Kiva Eger. Now, Rabbi Kiva Eger was one of the greatest Talmudists, one of the Talmudei Chachamim of Lita. And obviously that was from the world of Reb Tzadok, from the world that he came from. And he was so surprised by this chiddush of a thing where you can have a person who comes from a non-Chassidic background, not just anybody, but the grandson of Rabbi Kiva Eger, who knew, what Lita at its best was, that this started sort of like opening doors for him. And he began to ask Rabbi Eger, "Who's your Rebbe?" Because he said to himself, and Rabbi Eger answered, the Ishbitzer, Reb Mordechai Yosef Leiner, who is the Talmud of the Kutzker Rebbe. Rabbi Eger became his student. So he said to himself, the Rebbe who has the koyach to be the Rebbe of the grandson of Rabbi Kiva Eger, that I have to see for myself. So take me to your mat, take me to your leader, take me to your Rebbe, he told him. And this is what happened. Reb Tzadok came into the Mea Shilach, and they had an interesting back and forth. It's not relevant for right now. But at the end of the back and forth, it turned out Reb Tzadok proved that he knew how to learn, and the Ishbitzer Rebbe proved that he was a Rebbe. Mm-hmm. And everything changed. Everything changed. Reb Tzadok, something shifted in Reb Tzadok's mind. This is not what he traveled to Poland for. He came for his signatures, which he eventually got. But something changed. And people started to hear that something was changing. And fascinatingly enough, perhaps one of the most fascinating things that's in this biographical sketch is that we have printed among Reb Tzadok's letters an exchange that he had with a childhood friend who had stayed in Kreisberg in Lita, who became a Rav, and who sent Reb Tzadok a letter with the following. This is what he wrote in the letter. He said, "Im emes asher shamati alecha," if it's true. Or he wanted to know if it is true what I heard, ki nasis l'chaver elakat, that you became a friend of what they called the cult. That's how they refer to Chassidus, the cat. And he said, Halai akircha min urecha li ish emuna. I know you from your youth. You're an ish emuna. You're a faithful person. Uva atzmacha amartali. This is what his friend wrote, and we have this letter. He said, you yourself told me ki midina gemara asur l'schaber mechasidim, that you could prove from the Gemara that it's asur to connect to the Chasidim. You yourself told me that. V'lechein le'edam shmuas shav shamati ki sheker anubach. So therefore, because of what I know, what you told me when you were young, I don't know if they're telling a lie about you. Maybe you went off the derech. See, he's writing to him to find out if the rumors are true. And how could it be that he became close to Chasidim after he himself said that he could prove Medina de Gemara that it's asur to connect to Chasidim? We have the letter that Reb Tzadok wrote back. This is what he said. Emes hadavar ki na'asesi lechasid. He said, it is true, I joined the Chasidim. Aval gam lo yatzasi miyashasi. But I also did not go off or move away from my yashras. Ki mishpati al dvar Chassidus b'meinu urai. Because what I said about Chassidus when I was young, haya oiterem hikartia v'resia be'enai, was before I knew it up close. This is a huge klal. Because this is why the Baal Tanya went to the Vilna Gaon a number of times, that he should let the Gra see it up close and not make proclamations from afar, from based on things. He said, but now I saw it. He says, I was mistaken. Says Reb Tzaddik, if you want to understand what Chassidus is, and then make a psak, shama la'atzasi l'nsayel Rebbe. Do yourself a favor, listen to me, and go to a Rebbe. He says, you go, and then from what your own eye sees, from what your own experiences, then you can come out with a conclusion. But don't make conclusions from afar. So Reb Tzaddik says, sure, I said what I said about Chassidus, but it was irrelevant because I didn't know what I was talking about. Now I traveled into Poland. Now I met with the Divrei Chaim. Now I met with the Chidush Erim. Now I met with these tzaddikim, the Rebbe Eger and the Ishbitzer. Now I'm a different person. What changed? One of the things that changed when Reb Tzadok came to the Ishbitzer is that his neighbors could sleep. Because before he came to the Ishbitzer, his derech was, he would learn 24/7, he took little cat naps, and he would learn B'kol Ram shouting from the window, and his neighbors were complaining because they couldn't sleep at night because Reb Tzadok is just filling the whole building or the whole street with his learning. And after he came to Ishbitz, he learned quietly. It was one of the changes. He became much more inward. He decided that he could only eat at a Sudas mitzvah. He would never eat other than a Sudas mitzvah. How can you have a Sudas mitzvah? He made a siyum on a Masechta every single day. So every single day, Reb Tzadok made a siyum. He had one meal, and it was a Sudas mitzvah because of the siyum that he made. And this was his hanhaga. When the Ishbitzer heard about it, he became very upset. And he told Reb Tzadok, he said, I'm telling you as your Rebbe that you need to eat 2 meals a day. So Reb Tzadok made a cheshbon that making 2 mesechtas a day was a little bit too much, even for him. 2 mesechtas was too much, but he said I could still listen because it will still be a Sudas mitzvah. 1 meal that I eat a day will be a Sudas mitzvah because of the mesechta that I'm finishing. It will be a siyum. The second meal will be a Sudas mitzvah because I'm listening to my Rebbe. That's also Sudas mitzvah. So these were the 2 Sudas that he would eat every day, and he stayed by the Ishbitzer for 7 years. And Reb Tzadok wrote in a letter later on that the Ishbitzer convinced him, before he really became a Talmud, a Chassid, the Ishbitzer asked him to stay for Shabbos in Ishbitz. That was how he became a Chassid. He told him, Avrech me'achar Shabbasa, Ishar kan l'Shabbos. Once you're in town, stay for Shabbos. And Reb Tzadok later said, Nishmati elav, I listened to him. These are Reb Tzadok's own words. V'nisharti lishbay sham, and I stayed there for Shabbos. Sa'adati im Rebbe b'chol sudas, I ate with the Ishbitzer 3 sudas. Aval b'sudas shlishes, it was the 3rd meal, shalosh sudas. Very famous words. Chata haRebbe gachale eish alibi. The Rebbe shoveled fiery coals onto my heart. And that was the moment. He never left. He stayed in Ishbitzer. That was it. That was the moment everything changed. That Shalosh Shudas, you can imagine in the dark, Reb Tzadok, the Goin Adir, the Pella, the Yeled Pella, the Ilui. Something changed. He came to a recognition, which we're going to learn about in a minute. And this is what he said about his Rebbe. He said, Al-Mali haya bizmana ga'oinim haya goin. If the Ishbitzer would have lived in the time of the Ga'onim, he would have been considered a Goin. Bizman ha'amayroim haya amayra. If he would have lived in the time of the Amayroim, he would have been an Amayra. Bizman ha'tanaim haya tana. If he lived in the time of the Tanaim, the Ishbitzer would have been, said Reb Tzadok, a Tana. What can I tell you more? Hu chashav v'yakar etzli yaser mikol asfarim me'ela. More than any sefer that I have, the words that come out of the mouth, of the heart, of the mind of my Rebbe, says Reb Tzadok, is more precious to me. Mi yachali damis ilav. He said, who could compare to him? Ruach HaKodesh sharsa alav. Ruach HaKodesh rested on him. V'may eneinu, with our own eyes, re'inu etzle kamat b'tmidus ininu Ruach HaKodesh. The whole thing was Ruach HaKodesh. And it had to be, again, Reb Tzadok wasn't just a Chassidus Goin, who was predisposed to believe in these things. He was literally the archetype of the Lithuanian Talmud Chacham. The archetype. He was their, crowning jewel. He was their pride and joy. And everything changed for Reb Tzadok. And the story goes, very, very famous and beautiful story. At one time, Rabbi Yosef Rosen, the Rogatchover Rebbe, the Rogatchover Goin, came to visit Reb Tzadok. This is where Reb Tzadok was a little bit later on in years. And this really encapsulates what it was that changed for Reb Tzadok. You can read it here. This is one version. There are other versions, but this is a particularly sharp version that they bring here. There are a few versions of the story. I'll just read it to you inside. Pam migia alav hagoyin ha'ader Reb Yosef Rosen. The Rogatchover Goin came. Hanoide b'shmaya Rogatchover ubikish lefalpel ima b'divrei Torah. And he wanted to sit with Reb Tzadok and to be mefalpel in divrei Torah. Rabbeinu amnam kiblu b'sever panim yafos. Obviously, Reb Tzadok invited him and he greeted him warmly. Avo me'ein lefalpel imai. But he refused to get into the intricate Talmudic and halachic conversations. He refused to do that. But Amrullah, and he told him, "Ma yetzilanu min ha'pilpul." What's the point? What's going to come out of this pilpul? It's essentially going to be that I'm trying to prove that I know more than you. Right? And you're going to try to show that you know more than me. What will Hashem gain from this? You could hear this is the shift. Because it's all about Kvod Shemayim. It isn't a game. What does God gain? By me trying to show that it's gaiva. Like what's the point of this? Like, why is this a good usage of our time? And the Rogatchover was pressing him. Rabbeinu says, listen, I'm sure you know that when we say the bracha ata choin la'adam das, this is not what they mean. Because das is not genius. Das doesn't mean that a person has a really high IQ, that they're able to, to understand intricacies. That's not what das is. Obviously, this is from Hashem that you're here, so it's not a waste, because I want to tell you something. He said, I want you to know, I was just like you. I was also a wonder child. I was also brilliant. I was the same like you. And I defeated all of the great Talmidei Chachamim with my Torah learning. I knew more than them. I was more intricately just deep and broad and vast than they were. And this is, again, the version that they bring here. But after everything I saw, it is impossible to access what's called the crown of Torah without holding on to the threshold of the door of the students of the Baal Shem Tov. That's what he told him. There's Torah, there's pilpul, and then there's kisra shel Torah. And that's the das, which we thank Hashem for giving us in Shemana Esrei. Ata chaynu la'adam das doesn't mean genius. It could be a person who's not a genius, but they have das, they have wisdom. They have the wisdom of knowing that it's all about kvod shemayim. That's the wisdom. The wisdom of knowing what matters and what doesn't matter. What matters more, what matters less, what our priorities are. And over here you see Reb Tzadok, his whole life was changed. Imagine the journey from a young bacher, finished Shas, 8 years old, writing shalos utshuvas and kuntresim and battling with people in halacha, and then he grows up. And again, the only reason that he grew up is because he was compelled by very unfortunate circumstances to travel beyond his comfort zone and to come into contact with people who were different. They were also Talmidei Chachamim. The Chiddushei Urim was greater in pilpul than Reb Tzadok was. But over there he found something else. So much so that he writes that letter that we learned back to his childhood friend saying, you can have all the opinions of a Chassidus you want, but you don't really understand what you're talking about until you're in it. So once you're in it, it's something else. And from that point in time, Reb Tzadok disappeared. Reb Tzadok closed himself up in his little room. He remarried, and he refused to take any money for tzedakah. He had no money. He was super, super frugal. His wife had a secondhand clothing store. She worked and supported the two of them. As mentioned before, they were not able to bring children into the world. And he refused to write shalos utshuvas. Letters and letters and letters came, and they all went unanswered. He refused to teach Torah publicly. He sat and he wrote. And he wrote and he wrote Svarim. And he wrote and he wrote and he wrote and he wrote and he wrote. The little, whatever we have from Reb Tzadok, which is actually quite a lot, considering a tzaddik from that generation and everything that happened subsequently to European Jewry, is quite a lot. Many, many svarim. To list them all over here, I'll read you some of them. Oitzra Malach Arzur al Tzaddik, Divrei Chalaim is Divrei Seifrim, Dover Tzaddik, Sefer HaZachoros, 2 volumes. Yisrael Kadoshim, Levushit Tzedakah, Lekutim Amor, Machshavas Charetz, Meshev Hatana Meshev Tzedek, Poket Akarim, Pri Tzaddik. And it goes on and on. It's a whole list. Tzidkas HaTzaddik, which is the sefer we're going to be learning. And on and on and on and on is a tiny portion of what Reb Tzadok actually wrote. Tiny portion, and it takes up a bookshelf. A shelf in a bookshelf. A tiny portion. He wrote a commentary on the whole Zohar Kodesh. He wrote a commentary on the whole Rambam. He wrote a commentary on the whole Levush. He wrote Chidushei Shas, Chidushei Torah and Shas. He wrote a Pirush on Shulchan Aruch, and all of that we don't have. But what was left was Reb Tzadok's writings in Machshava and Chassidus. And he wrote and he wrote and he wrote and he wrote until 7 years later, his Rebbe was nifter, and there was a big battle over who would take over the Chassidus. The Ishbitzer was nifter, and the Chassidim split between the Ishbitzer's son, the Beis Yaakov, and Reb Eger. Some of the Chassidim went to the Beis Yaakov. I believe most of the majority of them went to Reb Eger, and Reb Eger wanted that Reb Tzadok should take this now, so that he should become the Rebbe, and he absolutely refused, rejected it. He considered Reb Eger his Rebbe, so he would give kvitlach and he would bring money for pidyon, and l'chal davar Reb Eger was the Rebbe, but Reb Eger considered him Talmud Chaver. He considered him in the same level. When he would walk into a room, Reb would stand for him. When he joined the tish, which was very rare because most of the time he just was by himself. He sat closed up, closeted in his room, but when he would come, they would put a similar chair to Reb Eger right at that of the table. They would sit there together, and they were sort of running the Chassidus together in that way until Reb Eger was nifter. And when Reb Eger was nifter, they sort of forced Reb Tzadok to become the Rebbe, and for a few short years, the last 7 or so years of his life, Reb Tzadok took over the leadership of the Chassidus, And this is where we have the Divrei Torah in the Sefer, very famous Sefer, Tzaddik, comes from his drushes at Tish. He would speak 10 times throughout Shabbos, and those are the drushes that are recorded in the Sefer Tzaddik from the very, very end of Reb Tzaddik's life. Ultimately, Reb Tzaddik was nifter, as mentioned, in the year
1900.
We say 1900, at the age of 77.
77, yes, 23.
And one of his students, who's called Reb Avram Yitzchak Rabinowitz, wrote down what it was like to be there at the time of the Petira of Reb Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin. And he says the following. I'm just going to read it to you because it's so powerful. He says on the 9th of the month of Elul. It was just Reb Tzaddik's Yartzai. At 10 o'clock in the morning, Achazo Hashevetz. Some kind of disease. Shevetz is, I don't know the exact translation, but some kind of fever, maybe
very high fever.
Yeah, high fever. Seized Reb Tzadok. When I heard the news, Ratzti Lebeisai, I ran to Reb Tzaddik's home. I saw a great crowd of people saying Tehillim u'mispalalim avur Rabbeinu HaKadosh, and davening for Reb Tzaddik. Ve'ishteh harabanit, and his wife, the Rebbitzin, and Bita, with her daughter, because again this was the third marriage, and she had brought a child from her first marriage. I met us Eitzel Aron HaKodesh HaPasuach. The Aron was open because I guess he had a shul in his living quarters. And they wailing with a voice that breaks the heart. Davening to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and this is from a person who was there. Right? This is his first eyewitness account. Davening to Hashem ki schus teirasei tamid lei, because he was kol kulei Torah from the time he was a little child. Again, finished Shas at 7, 13 years old, being mefalpo with all the Gedolei Hadar. This was a person who went through what he went through in life. Lahashiv nafshay, that Hashem should restore his vitality, his strength. Bein koi v'koi, and in the meantime, Azra Roifim, Chai La'ira, say that the doctors were doing everything they could to help him. Ulam, Arein HaKodesh Nishba. But he says at the end of the day, they were unsuccessful, and it didn't help. Kasher aleinu alma oina re'inu ki gufay hakadosh sheichel lasafa b'lu ruach. We ourselves saw that his body was laying there without any life. Ve'ala shulchan menachem asfarim shalama behem zelei kfar. And on his table were svarim that were open. He was in the middle of learning. Kol shinu lo nikra al panav. And we couldn't tell. There was no difference. On his face, he looked the same. V'nidme kilu hu yashen. It looked like he was sleeping. V'lulei divrei haroifim sha'amru shenav sheta ar parcha. The doctor said he wasn't alive anymore. They couldn't tell. Lo hayi ish mamin ki kfar nina b'chaim. It was just, he didn't look like a person who had died. Kol kach lo, and he says, upon further reflection, it was because we just didn't want to believe it. Kol kach lo chafatznu lahamin keinenu oid b'chaim. We didn't want to believe that he was no longer among the living. And I don't believe that it is impossible to suggest that one of the Sfarim that was open on his table was one of the Sfarim of Sifra Rabbeinu HaKadosh from Rabbi Nachman. Because one of the great Talmidei Breslov, one of the great Chassidei Breslov, who had occasion to be in Poland and to visit Reb Tzadok, was made that the Sfarim of Rabbi Nachman never left his table. We know Reb Tzadok wrote a commentary on Sefer Hamidus from Rabbi Nachman that he wrote before his bar mitzvah, was Sefer Hamidus, and Reb Tzadok wrote the Mara Makayvas. And to a person who's familiar with the writings of Reb Tzadok, and a person like many of us who are familiar with the writings of Rabbi Nachman, can see the influence, very strong influence, on the way that he learned from Rabbi Nachman how to mine psukim and mamar chazal to be able to elicit messages that aren't there apparent on the surface. Tzidkas Tzaddik is a primary example of this methodology, and it's going to be, you're going to see, very familiar. Because it really, through Sefer Hamidus, it seems that Sefer had such a powerful impact on Reb Tzadok that it impacted his own methodology, as we're going to see. But he was incredibly connected to the Sfarim of Rabbi Nachman. And what's more interesting is that he was even mekusher to the Sfarim of Reb Nosson, and not just Likutei Halachos, which obviously Reb Tzadok would have been familiar with, but the Sefer of the collected letters of Reb Nosson to his son, largely to his son Rabbi Yitzchak, which are the letters collected in a volume called Alim L'Trufa. When the Moicher Sfarim came around with Sfarim, Reb Tzadok wanted to purchase the Alim L'Trufa. And the Moicher Sfarim, the person who was selling the Sfarim, understood that Reb Tzadok is such a guy, and like he just wanted to let him know, maybe you're mistaken. He said, no, you don't need that Sefer, it's just letters. And Reb Tzadok said, with just letters? Reb Tzadok said, these letters are what give me strength to continue. So these letters from Reb Nosson are what are mechazik me. They give me the strength to do whatever learning I'm able to do, came from Alim L'Trufa. So he had a very, very deep and abiding connection with the Sifrei Breslov. And the Sfarim were still on the table. Bein Kai, he says, in the meantime, Nemale HaCheder Anashim, the whole room filled with people, V'abachias v'atza'akis ichrishu es aznayim, and the crying and the shouting was just resounding in our ears. V'yaisar harbe lahamir alav mishamasha yudel, and he had a gabbai, a shamash who was called a yudel, who was wailing more than any of them. Hu hipel atzmila aret, he threw himself to the ground, v'hika es roisha berutzba, and began to slam his head against the floor. V'tzak v'kol mar, and he cried out in a bitter voice, Ana nelech me'ata, where should we go now? So again, presumably he was a chassid. It's likely he could have been a chassid of the Ishbitzer, and then after the Ishbitzer, Rebbe Leibel, and then after Rebbe Leibel, Reb Tzaddik, and there was no one left. Like there was no one else. The Chassidus stopped after that. And this is what he was saying. Where should we go now? Ubitzel mina chasem achshav. Who should we seek refuge in now that Reb Tzaddik has left the world? After, says Rav Avram Yitzchak Rabinowitz, after it became clear to me that it was true that his soul left, Hafati od apam eini lehistakel b'fanav hakdoshim, I lifted my eyes one last time to look at his holy face. Because I was full of anguish, knowing that this would be the last time that I'm looking into the face of this Kohen HaGadol Shebegedolim, the face of this holy angel. And again, he felt like he was sleeping. And then I remembered the words of the Idra Kadisha, the words of the Zohar Kadosh al Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Zecher Tzaddik Levracha, about Reb Tzadok, Kasher Nestalik, that when Reb Tzadok, when Reb Shimon Bar Yochai left the world, Shachiv al Yamine, he was lying on his right side, V'ampai Chaychen, and on his face he had a little smile. V'leiv Karua Umurtach Azavti Asabayas. And when I remember that, I looked one last time at the face of Reb Tzadok, and I left the house. This was the extraordinary life of the Tzaddik who we're going to be learning from, who I know it took a very long time, and like came out, okay, we'll learn the first piece now, but it was impossible for me to imagine entering into the teachings of this Tzaddik without knowing who he was, without knowing the pain that he experienced in his life, without understanding the journey that he took, and why Reb Tzaddik is such a singular Tzaddik among all of the Gedolei Chassidus. Because of his background, because of what he knew and what he learned, because of the journey that he took, and most of all, because of the yageinu, because of the incredible genius, that although, like he told the Rogachover, that's not the ultimate goal, but when you bring genius into Chassidus and Machshava, you get something else. And perhaps this is the reason that Reb Tzadok so valued Rabbi Nachman Breslov, because he was known to refer to Rabbi Nachman as Gaon HaChassidus. He considered Rabbi Nachman to be the Gaon of all the Chassidish Rebbes. Rabbi Nachman, he recognized a certain genius that he appreciated. And like I said, we're going to see the methodology, not necessarily in the first piece that we'll learn together now, but as the Sefer unfolds. I can't promise we'll learn every single piece, not only because we may not finish the Sefer, which I hope we do, but because there are certain pieces, like in Kesser Shem Tov, that are more, more relevant and directly applicable to us. That Be'ezras Hashem will try to learn, those kinds of pieces. But as the Sefer unfolds, I think we're going to be able to hear the echo of Rabbi Nachman's method in terms of how to take a Maimer Chazal and how to discover something in that Maimer Chazal that you'd never see it in the Maimer Chazal on the surface, but somehow by mining, what's it really saying? We know what it's saying, but what's the implications deeper? That's what Rabbi Nachman's whole Torah is based on that, right? This pasuk, that pasuk, takes two pasukim that say what they say, and then they're connected because both of them say something deeper. And actually, this mitzvah is bechinas that, and that's connected to this. And he builds a structure of thought by looking deeper beyond what is apparent on the surface. This is the methodology that I believe Reb Tzadok got very much so from the Sifrei Breslov, and this is exactly the work that Reb Tzadok did with Sefer Amidas. Because Sefer Amidas is a collection of all of these implied teachings that Rabbi Nachman collected from the whole corpus of Tanakh and the whole Torah Shabbat and Shas Bali, Shas Yerushalmi, all the Midrashim, Sifra Sifri, Medrash Rabbah, everything, and all of the Kabbalistic writings from the Ramak and Ari, going back to the Zohar Kodesh and all of the previous teachings. And people who look at that Sefer, they say, where, what are these teachings? What's the Makar? These teachings have no Makar because nobody knew where Rabbi Nachman had gotten these teachings from. Again, this is Rabbi Nachman before his bar mitzvah, because he took them not like a collection of just Mamari Chazal, but he had this wisdom to listen very carefully, to listen to what is implied by this pasuk, by this Maimer Chazal. And Reb Tzadok wrote the Ma'arim HaKoymes. Reb Tzadok, who knew Kol HaTorah Kula on his fingertips, was able to go through Sefer Amidas, and he was able to intuit, to be able to feel where Rabbi Nachman got this idea from. Why is it, let's say, just one, that a woman who's having a difficult pregnancy should put an apple on her head? Whoever heard of such a thing? Doesn't say that anywhere in Chazal. And Reb Tzadok is able to find an obscure pasuk, which if you learn it, al pi drush, al pi remez, al pi side, Rosh Tevis, Sefer Tevis, this is where Rabbi Nachman got it from. So I believe very strongly that you could see the impact of Sefer Amidas, which is just a microcosmic, sort of encapsulation of the longer drushes in Likutei Moharan that are also built on this same kind of methodology. I believe that had a massive impact on Reb Tzadok, the Gaon Chassidus impacting the Gaon from Lita, who came to Poland and woke up to a whole other way of experiencing not just Avodas Hashem in general, but Limud HaTorah b'frat. That a person can only access the keser of Torah through the mahalach of the das that was revealed by the Baal Shem HaKadosh and his students. So with that very lengthy introduction, with the last few minutes, take a look at Tzidkas HaTzaddik number 1. And the Tzaddik says the following: Reishis knisas ha'adam la'avodas Hashem tzarich lias b'chipazon. These words were written because Tzidkas HaTzaddik was published only one single year after he met the Ishbitzer. And Tzidkas HaTzaddik is not like quasi, sort of Litvish hashkafa, but like melding into that, which you would expect. Some of the sharpest, most radical of all Hasidic, approaches to a variety of different issues are presented in this slim sefer that was just 1 year after meeting the Ishbitzer. Meaning the impact was so total that it changed his life legamri. And this is what he writes over here in the first piece of the first section of Tzidkas HaTzaddik, which is a commentary on certain Agadas related to Maseches Brachas. And then after that, it's sort of like random bits and pieces of different advice and different perspectives on Avodas Hashem, like I said, that emerge from Psukim and Mamari Chazal, where Tzaddik mines them and is able to extract brand new ideas that we would never be able to discover them on our own, but through the writings of Reb Tzaddik, you can encounter them. So here Reb Tzaddik says, Reishis knisas ha'adam la'avodas Hashem tzarich lias b'chipazon. When a person begins to serve Hashem, it has to be with alacrity. Like we see when Klal Yisrael were redeemed from Mitzrayim, they ate the food b'chipazon. They had to eat it quickly, the Karban Pesach. But like Pesach Dairis, but you don't see that for any of the future Yom Tovim of Pesach. It was just that first Pesach, they had to eat the Karban Pesach b'chipazon very, very quickly. Why? When a person is trying to disassociate themselves and elevate themselves beyond the physicality of this worldliness, if there's a moment, an opening, there's a hisayrus, says Reb Tzadok, do it all the way. If there's an opening and a person finally feels like, what's the point? What is the point of all of this? I feel deeply that it's not giving me meaning and fulfillment. I'm not getting what I want to get out of this anymore. It's not doing what I thought it would do for me. And a person has that feeling like, wow, I'm mamish wasting my life. I'm wasting my time. There's a moment like that. We learned in Keser Shem Tov, it's an aspect of the baskel that comes out from Shemayim on our chayr of Oylahem, right? Lebriya me'abayna shal Torah or shuvu banim shayvavim. This is the hisayrus. So says Reb Tzadok, v'lach boitz al oisa rega, a person should grab hold al oisa rega, and to hurry lemaher lotzis mehem ulayucha. Because maybe now's the time. And not to take one step. If there's an opening, try to go all the way. Try to mamish, like we learned from the Piyasetzner Rebbe based on the Ramban, im te'iru, im ta'iras ha'ava, ad shetechbatz, right? What that means to make a kli, to make a vessel, make a chayfetz for it. If there's ava, if avas Hashem is awoken in a person's heart, try to make a vessel, try to do something that it should be real. Bring it into this world. It says Reb Tzadok, b'chipazon, don't wait. Because you never know how inspiration might fade. And you never know how you get distracted. And before you know it, the hisayrus is gone, especially now in Elul. There can be moments of awakening. So says Reb Tzadok, b'chipazon, you can't get out of Mitzrayim slowly. You get out of Mitzrayim, one fell swoop. You try your best to go as quickly as you can. V'achar kach, says Reb Tzadok, shuv yelech b'mesinos v'la'at. After a person has first made that break, like jailbreak, and you're out of Egypt, and you've gone, then you can go b'mesinos v'la'at. Then you can go steadily, bit by bit. Kidin Pesach Dairis, like all of the other experiences of Pesach throughout history, which aren't just not quickly, that we have a Seder. The whole thing is that it goes in order. But the first moment needs to be a big moment. And in that moment you can take on big things. You can ask for great madrigas. You can break free in that moment. You can. So Reb Tzadok tells us right in the beginning of the Sefer, in the beginning of a new series of shiurim, if you get a iris from this and you're woken up in some way by that story of the rugged shaver coming to Reb Tzadok, and Reb Tzadok telling him, I was like you once, I know it's cute and it's fun and we're geniuses beyond geniuses, but this is not really what it's all about. And a person stops and thinks, how can I connect to that das? How can I connect to that light of what it really means to let Hashem in? What it really, really genuinely means. Not just to, daven and learn, but to bring Hashem into it. Says Reb Tzadok, move quickly because the inspiration fades. And the way to make sure the inspiration doesn't fade is to act. Once a person acts, even if it's not with the right, sort of seder, and a person's not with like being conscious of the whole order of the things that the way that things should be, it doesn't matter. You'll figure that out afterwards. Right now, take something on yourself, even if it's l'mala mimadrigascha. Okay, that's the days of Sfira. You build vessels bit by bit, step by step. But the first thing is getting out of Mitzrayim is b'chipazon. Zeuchuso yageinu aleinu v'al kol Yisrael amen. May His merit stand by us, the privilege of reading those words that He wrote, hiding out, in Ishbitzer, in solitude. He was writing this for us. He understood that his time would be best used if he hid himself away and wrote and wrote and wrote. Kulei v'ulai, maybe some of his writings would survive, which they did, and we're the beneficiaries of them. So Hashem should bless us at the outset of something new. B'Shem Hashem Nasav v'Natzliach. Thank you so much to everybody who's joining us on the Zoom, everybody who will be watching this, and everybody who came and joined us in person. Hashem should bless us. We should make this journey and gain from the writings and from the thoughts and the feelings of this extraordinary Tzaddik, Reb Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin. Zeuchuso yageinu aleinu v'al kol Yisrael.
Passed away
Amen.
when in Amen. When did he pass away? Elul, you said, when is his yard site?
I believe it was the 7th, right? The 7th? Go look back inside. Okay, Yashar Koach Yidin. Thank you so much for joining. Be'ezus Hashem.
So, yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much for joining us, everybody. Thank you so much.
ואתה האב שלי שכל כך אוהב אותי, האב שלי מלך חי וקיים על כל נשימה שאני